So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for the DeFord lecture series. My name is Elizabeth Catlos and I'm a faculty member in the Department of Geological Sciences at UT Austin. We are a part of the Jackson School of Geosciences, and the DeFord lecture series is our departmental seminar series. It's been a requirement and tradition for all of our graduate students since the late 1940s. The lecture series is named after Professor Ronald DeFord, who joined the university as a professor in 1948 with the purpose of enhancing the quality of the graduate program in the department. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them in the Q&A box in your Zoom control panel. The chat's been disabled, but the Q&A is available throughout the presentation. We'll bring them up after the talk. Also, the recording of the talk is going to be available on the DeFord website, and we encourage you to share it with your social networks. So our speaker today is going to be introduced formally by Dr. Joel Johnson, who's an associate professor in the Department of Geological Sciences. Joel?
Great, thank you. Welcome everyone. So it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Nicole Gasparini to give today's lecture. Nicole is an associate professor at Tulane University in New Orleans. She got undergraduate degrees in both math and geography, and then master's degree and a PhD from MIT. Nicole and I actually overlapped in grad school, which is how we know each other originally. She was in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering for her graduate work with advisor Raphael Bross. And after that, she did a postdoc at Yale. She was a GSA AAAS congressional fellow working in a congressional office. And since then has been at Tulane since 2008. At Tulane, Nicole does many things, of course. She is a faculty advisor for the Tulane group of Geo-Latinas. Nicole and I have also been co-PIs on a couple NSF grants, including one actually in the Guadalupe Mountains of Texas, looking at lithology, which is Nicole's background, which I definitely appreciate. Nicole is active on Twitter, for those of you who are also active on consuming Twitter. And finally, I'm delighted to say that Nicole is a GSA fellow for this year. She got that award. So without further ado, Nicole.
Okay, thank you. Oh, sorry. Okay, Joel, if this can't be seen, please send me.
It looks great.
Okay.
It's exactly what you want.
Great. All right, thank you so much for hosting me today, Joel and Liz and the rest of the department and everyone who showed up, wherever you may be. So I'm excited to talk about some work that I did with a team in the South Fork Eel River watershed, which is in Northern California. And so I'm Nicole, there's my Twitter handle, because I'm active on Twitter, and if you want to follow me. And the work that I'm going to show you today was funded by NSF. Some of it uses the LandLab modeling tool, which I had the great privilege to show to some of the people in the department today, so that was really fun, and that's made possible by CSDMS, Community Surface Dynamics Modeling System organization, which is also NSF funded. And then also, the people that prop me up, and part of those people are the Geo-Latinas at Tulane. Okay, and then of course I can't move forward without saying thank you to all the people who enable me to be successful, because my current day-to-day is really not doing very much research at all. I just kind of ride on the coattails of all of these wonderful people. And for those of you who have been in the Jackson School for a little bit, you may recognize Brendan Murphy in this crew. And so Brendan was part of a project that Joel And I got funded, actually, my very first NSF, and possibly Joel's very first NSF too. And Brendan was a great contributor to that project. All right, I always just like to start out with a little bit of something that's not, it's maybe let's call science parallel. And I think everyone is thinking a lot about how we can make academia and science and STEM more inclusive these days. So I like to start off with these pictures. So the first one on the left is me. That's actually a picture that I think Joel may have taken. I was about 5 months pregnant in that picture, and that was my first pregnancy. And I felt great, and I worked like literally until an hour before I went to the hospital. I was working, and I really never slowed down at all. In my second pregnancy, which is the picture in the middle, that was me at about 6 weeks pregnant, and that was the last time I went in the field. And then for the rest of my pregnancy, I barely moved from bed. I felt horrible. It really slowed me down. And so of course, after pregnancy, I was like, let me get back in the field, but what does that look like? So there I am with my daughter, visiting the Elwell Dam removal site. And I'm a pretty privileged person. I'm cis, white, hetero, daughter of an academic. And still there's roadblocks for me. So I just encourage everyone every day to think about like, who is this space made for? Who is successful and who can thrive, and also who can't. And just every day, if you keep that in mind, it sort of helps us to move forward and make slow progress on these really, really important things that lead to more better science and more science coming out. All right, so what is this project? So the South Fork Eel River project is, I like to present this project when I give seminars, because first of all, I know there's some grad students, and one of the take-home messages from my talk that you'll see is that what we thought originally and even published, I think, is now wrong, and that's just part of the scientific process. But I think it can feel really scary, especially if you're just starting out. I'm lucky that I have tenure already, so it's less of an issue. So I like this story for that reason. And it also has like a lot of different moving parts, which I think if you've interacted with Joel at all, you know that surface processes is kind of really integrative kind of science. And so you're going to see a lot of that in this talk, how we take lots of bits of geochemistry and mapping and modeling and put them all together. So the story really started out before me, before I came to this project. On the left is Ben Crosby at Idaho State. On the right is Jane Willenbring, who's now at Stanford. And they had done the mapping and they had collected the samples. And they were like, well, we think we know what's going on in this landscape. Can you just run a model to support the data, and we'll be done with this. 12 years later, so they initially chose this watershed, but one of the reasons why that they were looking in the South Fork Eel River watershed is because it's a transient landscape. And so one of the reasons why I've studied transient landscapes is because I'm really interested in surface processes. So I'm interested in, what are the details of how sediment moves around on the surface of the earth? And then from that, how does that influence topographic form and the shape of landscapes and how landscapes change over time? If we can get those details right, then we can understand better how landscapes have changed in the past and where they might be going in the future. And so one of the things that we realized a bit ago is that if you look at transient landscapes, which are landscapes that are not steady or they're changing through time and often changing in space as well, they're oftentimes better places to understand and quantify surface processes, okay? So many geomorphologists are drawn to transient landscapes. But then it's a double-edged sword, right? Because a transient landscape is pretty complicated because it is changing in time and it's not steady. So we have to sort of work through all of these things. And what you're going to see is we got a little bit misled when we started this process. So what I'm going to show you on the right-hand side here is an animation of a transient of it steady. It's a transient landscape, but I'm going to show you some of the aspects that we identify in transient landscapes. So this is a watershed, and what you can see, I just drew on there, you see what looks like a contour line, that red line. So that contour line is marking where the landscape transitions from what we would call an old or relic topography and a new or adjusting or adjusted topography, okay? So the relic topography is going to be the highest parts of the landscape, and oftentimes when I said what looks like a contour line, oftentimes a transition from relic topography to adjusted topography is going to happen at about the same elevation throughout the watershed, so that's why that red line looks like a contour line. And so above that contour line, above that transition, you have the relic topography, which in this case means gentle slopes, low relief. And then when you move downstream or to the lower elevations, you have what is the adjusting or the steep slope topography. This is where you have incised gorges. And this is what you see in the South Fork Eel, but in many transient landscapes. And so in this case, what you have is upstream in the relic topography, you have low erosion rates and low channel incision rates. But downstream, you have high erosion rates. And now, so those two arrows are meant to represent the magnitude of local river incision. Okay, so the small arrow is a lower rate, and the high arrow, or the larger arrow is a faster rate of incision. Okay. And so what Jane and Ben did before I came to the project was they collected along the main stem of the South Fork Eel River, they collected a number of samples of cousinogenic radionuclides, they collected a number of sand samples, which they used to date as cousinogenic radionuclides to get the upstream averaged erosion rate. Okay, so at each one of those stars, they collected a sample, they ran it geochemically. This is like what Jane does, and they figure out what is the upstream spatially averaged and time averaged erosion rate. And because those stars are integrating more and more of the entire watershed, they get a pattern that is integrating more and more of the relict and adjusting topography, okay? So if you look at this, this is a river profile. I'm going to show a lot of images of river profiles in this talk. So a profile is exactly what you think it is. It's elevation versus distance. You don't have to worry about the values here. This is a pretty big river. So that blue line is the topography or the elevation of the main stem of the South Fork Eel River. And if you look at that place where you see that sort of real steepening that I just highlighted with the red circle, that is what we would call a knick point or a knick zone. Technically, it's not really a point, but I'm going to use the term knick point because that's what we commonly say. And a knick point is an over-steepened reach. So you can see upstream of this here, the channel is gentler, and then all of a sudden it steepens up, okay? And in this steep zone is that transition where you go from upstream relict to downstream adjusted, and that's marked by a knick point. A very discrete knick point, if you're not familiar with this term, a very discrete knick point would be a waterfall, okay? But this is not a discrete knick point, it's just a very long stretch of very steep channel, okay? Also in this, what you will see, you see all of those little black dots. Those black dots are mapped river terraces, and this is a lot of the work that Ben Crosby and his team did, was they went out and they mapped a bunch of locations which are river terraces. And all that means is at one time the riverbed was at that elevation, and now it has cut down to that blue line that you see there, and that's the river profile, okay? So we know there is this knick point that is in the river, and the question is, how did it get there? Why is that knick point there? Why is the upstream gentle and the downstream is deeply incised? Why are the slopes really steep downstream and the upstream topography is much gentler? So we have two ideas about what can form a knick point and why you might see this pattern of transient landscape, okay? So one idea is that there could be a signal in the watershed that starts at the bottom of the watershed or at the mouth of the watershed, and it propagates upstream. So that's shown here on the left. And what you can see, the top are river profiles. And what you would have had is initially, you would have a river profile that looks like this. So the river profile initially would go through those red dots. Something happens at the downstream end of the river, and all of a sudden the river starts incising down. Okay, so what in this case, what that would have been is the South Fork Eel River is a tributary to the Eel River. So if the Eel River started incising down very rapidly, that would mean the lower part of the South Fork would come down in elevation, and then that can send a signal propagating upstream in the river through time. And so what that ends up being is the river at one time might look like this, and then it keeps cutting down and cutting back and cutting down. And that would be what we would call an upstream propagating signal. In that case, if it leaves behind terraces, so remember, terraces are just those former stream beds that are left in the hillside that you can go and look at. If it leaves behind terraces with datable material on that terrace, what you would expect from this type of signal would be a terrace age that decreases upstream, okay? So the oldest terrace would have been formed long ago at the outlet or downstream, and then the terrace age youngs upstream. So there's another way that you can get a nick point in a channel, and that could be by threshold driven erosion. So in this case, what would happen, again, you start off with a river that's like this. But instead of a upstream propagating signal, you just pin the river at some point, and then downstream of this pinned point, the river starts incising down everywhere at the same rate, okay? So now, in this case, you would start like this, and then at one time you would have just below that red dotted line, and so on and so forth until you came to today, where you have this nick zone formed, and then this is the upstream relict area, and then this is the downstream adjusted or adjusting landscape. So what would happen here is if you could date these terraces, you would see at the same, at this highest elevation, the terraces would all have the same age, okay? So these are two ideas for how you can form relict topography and a nick zone within a river channel, okay? All right, so we have the topography, that main channel of the South Fork Eel has that big nick zone. We can look at the topography, can look at the hill slopes. We know we have this upstream relict and this downstream adjusting. And so the question is why? What kicked this off? What led to this transient state in the South Fork Eel River? And one of the questions we wanted to answer is, if this transient, if there's two different reasons, like I showed you in the previous slide, an upstream propagating signal versus that pinned threshold area, could they result in the same topographic patterns? And if they result in the same topographic patterns, would they still result in the same erosion patterns? Because I've already told you we've measured erosion rates all down the main stem of the South Fork. So we're wondering, can we tell the difference between those two types of triggers in the erosion pattern? And so what's great, this is where I came in, and if you can't see me in your tiny little Zoom box, that's my face right there, smiling and happy because even modelers get to go in the field. So that's when they came to me and they said, let's run a model and let's figure this out, Nicole. Can we sort of test some of these scenarios? Okay, so as all good scientists, we had a hypothesis, right? So we started out this story assuming we knew why this landscape was transient. And our hypothesis was that the passage of the Mendocino Triple Junction led to the creation of this transient landscape. And that's why we had a nick point. So here's the story here. So if you don't know about the Mendocino Triple Junction, it's just offshore of California. It's a place where three plates come together. And the location of this triple junction has migrated northwards through time. So initially the triple junction was down south, and that triple junction migrated northwards through time, and here it is at its current location. So this is, if you're not, this is California. Here is the South Fork Eel, this little blue line right here. So what it means is that the headwaters of the South Fork would have felt this migration of the triple junction through time. So if you just look over here, Here's California. This red outline is the outline of the South Fork Eel River watershed, which is zoomed in right here. And if you look, this is like where the Triple Junction started out, and it migrated northwards through time. And as it migrated, it did complex things to the rock uplift pattern. So this is highly simplified. I know there's a lot of geodynamicists in the audience, and yeah, this is a geomorphologist view of passage of the Mendocino Triple Junction, very highly simplified. But if you look at this plot right here, this is rock uplift rate, and this is distance. So this is southeast or Southern California, and the migration of the Triple Junction is going to be towards the north. So initially, what people think, and this is mostly from modeling, from geodynamic models, we think that the Triple Junction, as it migrates, it makes this complex pattern of rock uplift that's kind of like a bell curve. And so rock uplift rates are going to be sort of highest at the Triple Junctions here. It's going to be highest somewhere lagging behind. And then there's an area with lower rock uplift rates. But through time, as the Triple Junction passes northwards, the place where rock uplift rates were once highest, rock uplift rates will decline through time. And similarly, places where rock uplift rates were low, those will increase through time. So what we have is both a spatial and temporal pattern in rock uplift rate. And so we hypothesized that this pattern that affected rock uplift throughout the South Fork Eel River may be responsible for this transient landscape, okay? So why would we think that? So an early study 20 years ago now from Snyder and colleagues actually showed that there was a pattern in coastal rivers that fit the passage of the Mendocino Triple Junction. So if you look, this is a paper from Snyder et al. And here's the watershed that we're studying, South Fork Eel River. They looked at a bunch of these tributaries, okay? So these tributaries should be experienced similar uplift pattern as this whole entire South Fork Eel River watershed. And so if you look at this, this is southeast to northwest, so southeast to northwest. And these are the uplift rates in those different channels. So lowest uplift here, and then highest uplift here. Okay, so sort of that bell curve shape if you squint your eyes. Now, what they did was they mapped out something called channel steepness. And channel steepness, it doesn't matter if you understand exactly the details of it right now, it's thought to vary with erosion rate, okay? So a higher channel steepness should be indicative of a higher erosion rate, assuming all the rocks are the same. And so according to them, the rocks are all the same, but you have this pattern in steepness that kind of matches the uplift rate. So they said, look, you can see this pattern of rock uplift in these coastal channels. So why not when we see it in the South Fork? So we made that hypothesis that it was the passage of the Triple Junction that led to this transient topography. So we started out the study saying we know the topography is transient, and I still feel like that is a good thing that I know. We know the landscape has not been glaciated, so we're sort of throwing out glacial processes from this story. We started out saying that the rocks are essentially uniform. It's kind of, you know, this big, just sedimentary rock complex, and that we knew it's tectonically complex. So that passage of the Triple Junction and uplift rates increasing and decreasing through time, it's really complex, and so maybe that triggered the transient. Okay, so what I'm going to do in this talk is I'm going to start off with our initial story, which was published in 2013. And then I'm going to show you the most recent research that we've done to try to expand that story, and turns out we're maybe turning over that story. So if you don't make it through with me to the end of this talk, here's the punchline. I think our initial story was wrong. So I actually don't think that it's the passage of the Mendocino Triple Junction that caused this landscape to be transient. And I don't think that's why we have a big mix zone. And I think it could be a climate signal, maybe. And we probably way oversimplified things when we started off. We said all the rocks are the same and everything's sort of close enough, and we did what I would call lumping instead of splitting. So we took things that were kind of sort of close and just threw them all together when we should have probably looked at the differences rather than the similarities. But again, I've got tenure, so it's easy for me to say, this is a complicated landscape, and I think this is all just part of science and why science is so fun, because you get to keep looking at the data, you get to collect more data and reassess what you thought. And this is great because through this whole process, we're getting better at modeling and better at interpreting landscapes. Okay, so here's the initial story. Here's the part that's already published. So like I said, Ben and Jane had already been in the field. So what they did was, this is the profile of the South Fork Eel River. So this is the main stem. And then all these little things that are popping off, those are tributaries to the South Fork Eel, okay? And so all of these tributaries drain into the main stem of the South Fork Eel. Those red dots indicate about where a knickpoint was mapped. And that mapping of the knickpoint was done, it should really be at the knickpoint top, and that was done by Ben Crosby, okay? And so the solid black lines are, again, the tributary and the main stem today. But if you look at that dashed line, and that could have been maybe the elevation of the main channel before it started incising down, before the transient, okay? And if you squint your eyes, the red dots, they're all kind of at about the right elevation to be sort of former terraces, okay? Or to be terraces or former bottom of the river. Okay, so what we did was we took those elevations from those knickpoints and we roughly drew out that contact between the relict topography and the adjusted downstream topography. So we use the information on where's the knickpoint top, we use information on what the slopes of the hill slopes are to draw this topography. So this is kind of a complicated map up here. Here's the outlet of the watershed. So this is the South Fork. That thick blue line is the main stem. And then the brownish orangey area inside is the adjusted topography. And then that black outline is that looks sort of like a contour. That's the division between the adjusted topography that is in this orangey area and then the upstream relict topography. Okay, so we can map out where's adjusted and where's relict. All right, and then I also told you that Jane collected a bunch of samples to do plasmogenic radionuclide sampling on sands that are in the channel bed. And so the idea here is that because those sands are in the channel bed, they're integrating everything that's in the upstream watershed. So you're getting an upstream averaged erosion rate from these samples. And what did we find? So now if you look at these stars, the size of the star and also the axes on the right will indicate what that upstream average erosion rate is. And it's not perfect, but roughly what you see is this downstream increase in erosion rate, okay? But remember, this is an erosion rate, so this erosion rate should be integrating the erosion from all of the upstream part of the watershed. So what we see is as you move downstream, it looks like you're integrating more and more faster erosion. Okay, so now here's where I come in, and at this time we were using a model called CHILD to do the landscape evolution. And what we did was we took a watershed that is not the exact South Fork Eel, but it is very similar in its shape. So here we have it's 93 kilometers, which is roughly the length of the South Fork Eel. The South Fork Eel watershed is long and narrow. So even though ours is a perfect rectangle, it has a very similar dimensions, okay? And so this is the watershed. It's this rectangular watershed. You can see the main stem. And we're gonna hit it with this uplift pattern where we start off with this background uplift rate, and then earlier we raise uplift rates in the headwaters, and then we're gonna send this wave through. And as we do that, because it's a model and we can do anything we want with the model data, we can perfectly inquire on it. We can do the same kind of erosion mapping. So we can collect samples for upstream averaged erosion rate. We can look at the channel profile through time, and we can look at the transition between relict and adjusting topography. Okay, so this is just a snapshot, and what you can see is here's a channel profile. That would be the channel profile through here. You can see this contact between relict and adjusting, and then you can see the erosion rates. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a movie. Let me, hopefully this will work. Up here is going to be the rock uplift pattern. So what you're going to see is a wave coming in, first entering at the head of this watershed, then it's going to move through. This is a map, and the map is going to show you what the local incision rate is, so what the rate at which the river is down cutting, not the upstream average. Then we're going to sample at each of these points. Down here, what you'll see is the channel profile, and then you'll see the erosion rate, the upstream average erosion rate showing from these points here. So that's on the right axis. And then what you're going to see is down here, this is time on this axis and basin-wide erosion rate. So you're going to see those points and the patterns in those points through time. All right, so this is starting out, which you can see the rock uplift wave starts at the headwaters. And there's not too much going on when you look at the map. But once that uplift wave leaves, what you can see is a wave of incision shooting up the channel. You can see that knickpoint propagating upstream, and you can see that pattern of erosion rates changing from upstream to downstream. What you'll also notice is if you let this model run for long enough, what you'll see is the pattern of erosion rates flips, and then you get the lowest upstream average erosion rates at the mouth, and upstream you have the highest upstream average erosion rates. So what's kind of fun about this is that we can come up with a pattern that visually looks very similar to what we saw in the South Fork Eel River. So you can see you have this pattern of increasing upstream average erosion rates. You have that increasing towards downstream. You have a nice nick zone. Of course, everything in the model is much smoother. That's just the way the models operate. But we felt pretty good, and we were like, wow, this is really cool. We can create a pattern very similar to what we see in the South Fork from this upstream propagating signal. So we felt great about that, and we got the paper published, and I promised you it was reviewed many, many times. And so we said, well, look, you can hit this landscape with this pattern of rock uplift, and you get this transient signal. And in fact, at some points, erosion rates may increase downstream. At some points, they may decrease downstream. And we see that big response happening after the wave moves through. So while the wave is actually in the watershed, not much is going on. So that's published, and we felt great. And then what we did was we got a proposal funded. That was actually all unfunded work that we did. We finally got a proposal funding. We're going to fill in some gaps with the erosion rate data, look at the tributaries, and try to do some more modeling to better understand this. So now we're going to dig deeper and get to those known unknowns. And this is where the two people on the left come in. So the top is Nathan Lyons. He joined the team at Tulane as a postdoc, and then Kate Weirs, who did a master's at Idaho State with Ben Crosby. All right, so kind of almost immediately off the bat, this is sort of the great thing about bringing new people onto a research team. Nathan started, asking some probing questions that made me slightly uncomfortable. And one thing that we sort of started to realize is when we got this pattern, so if you look at this, this is again erosion rate on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. The time where we get this pattern of this is upstream, this is downstream, so erosion rates increasing from upstream to downstream, that happens after the uplift wave has completely left the watershed. But if you look at the location of the Triple Junction and the location of the South Fork Eel, the uplift wave should really still be in the watershed. So we created the same pattern, but the timing is really off. So can we really attribute the transient landscape that we see in the South Fork Eel to the passage of the Triple Junction, okay? So if you go back to how I started off this talk, I said there's two ideas for formation of a knickpoint. There's that upstream propagating signal, which we really had hung our hats on initially, and that's what came out of the modeling, was that upstream propagating signal that gave us a good pattern of erosion rates that matched what we saw. But the one thing we hadn't really tested was the terrace ages. So with this upstream propagating pattern, you should see that the terrace ages should young upstream. Okay, so the oldest terraces should be downstream. Whereas if you had this erosion threshold, or if you just sort of pinned at an area everywhere downstream started eroding or incising faster, then your terrace ages should be more or less uniform, okay? So we kind of said, let's explore this, and that was the work of Kate Weir's. So if you look at this, this is, if you've never seen a terrace before, and this is what we would particularly call a strath terrace, which is a bedrock terrace. This is a phenomenal example of a strath terrace. So this, this is Emma, and Emma is standing in the river, okay? But she's standing in the river on some debris that's in the river, so she's propped up. But this is the river right here, the modern river. And this on the bank is bedrock, okay? And this bedrock has some surface that's under there, okay, that you'd have to clean off to find exactly where that contact is. And what you can see here is a bunch of gravel that was fluvially deposited on that surface. So what this is underneath there at about here somewhere is the former channel bed, okay? So that's a terrace. And what you can do is you can go in there and you can grab some of that material that was deposited on that terrace to date it, to figure out roughly the time when the channel abandoned that level and started incising down. So that's how we went about dating these terraces. And this is really a phenomenal example of a strath terrace. This is probably the best one I've ever seen. And this is from the watershed. Okay, so this is the work that Kate did. And if you look at what Kate found, so now you may recognize this. This is an image that you saw already, this plot. This is elevation versus distance. This is the main stem. That blue line is the main stem of the South Fork eel. And all of those black dots are places where from high resolution LiDAR data, terraces were mapped. Okay, so those elevations are just mapped. Those terrace elevations are mapped from the DEM. Kate was able to go in and sample a bunch of these terraces, and using OSL, she was able to figure out what the ages of, or the material that is just deposited right on top of that terrace. And if you look at this, this is age versus upstream distance. Well, you can tell me what, you just look at that for a second. Do you see an upstream younging? Do you see downstream younging? Does it look about uniform? So remember, if we had an upstream propagating signal, we would expect the terrace age to be younger upstream. And if we had sort of a threshold signal, we would expect the terrace age to be all about the same as you move from upstream to downstream. So the way that we interpret this is that those terrace ages are all roughly the same, and most of them overlap with error. Okay, it was actually very difficult to collect these data. And so yes, ideally we would have a lot more samples with a lot less error bars in there, but or uncertainty in there. But this is what we got. So we interpret this actually, that the highest terrace age is all pretty uniform. And so maybe that initial interpretation of that upstream propagating signal from the passage of the Triple Junction might actually not be right. There's a little bit of other detail to the story that I'm not going to present here because it takes a long time to explain, that also supports the idea that this may actually be a threshold driven, an area threshold driven perturbation, and that if we go with the terrace ages being about 100,000 years old, and again, a lot of uncertainty there, this could be related to MIS5, interglacial period, And there is some thought that during, right as you go from glacial to interglacial, you do get down cutting of the river that could leave behind a terrace. So this is kind of what we think now for the mainstem, that the mainstem may actually be, it may have been a threshold area and we got this kind of uniform terrace age, and it has nothing to do with the passage of the Triple Junction. All right, so now we have this new hypothesis, and you're probably like, Nicole, you gotta finish talking in about 5 to 10 minutes. Just gonna give you a few little tidbits of some other ideas we have for the evolution of this watershed and what might be going on and influencing it. So if we change our model to be this, so this is the main stem, and the main stem starts cutting down everywhere, erosion rates increase at the same time downstream of some point. What happens to the tributaries? Okay, so this is the main stem, but what about the tributaries? How do they respond? So what we think might be happening is that this threshold area, so remember, this requires some threshold drainage area. It's very possible that many of these tributaries may not have had the threshold drainage area to actually start incising at the same time that the main channel did. And so that could lead to a very complex response where the main channel cuts down, the tributaries kind of hang out and get a big waterfall where they come into the main stem. And at some point, their evolution kicks on, and then you get an upstream propagating signal in the tributaries. So this is kind of what we are thinking about right now for the evolution of the system. So two different responses going on. And then what Nathan did was he took a closer look at the tributaries. And so be careful, because the map is flipped now, because Nathan looks at things differently. So here's the outlet. So here's upstream. So this is the outlet, and if you follow the main stem upstream, what you'll note, you see this whole area right here that's red, and even into here that's colored red. That's the nick zone in the main stem of the river, okay? And the color is by something called steepness, which I've mentioned before. And steepness should be a proxy for erosion rate, okay? So a greater steepness usually means faster erosion, but it can also mean harder rocks, and it can also mean bigger sediment. So those are all and ors. So Nathan looked at this and he said, Nicole, look at this. All of the channels in the west, they don't have really high steepness, but all of the channels in the east, well, many of the channels in the east have these red zones or really high steepness. What's going on there? So if you go back to the map, and it's kind of hard to find a good map of this area, but if you go back to the geologic map, yeah, everything's kind of, you know, sedimentary rock, but there are some differences. And if you look at this map, you can see the orange areas are melange, and the gray areas I'm just going to call non-melange, okay? And if you look at where those orange areas are, they roughly correspond to where in the tributaries we have higher steepness. So they could either be harder rocks, there could be boulders in those channels, or possibly they're eroding faster. So if you look at this plot, now this is, again, this is downstream and this is upstream, and this is just a channel profile. If you look at this plot, the main stem is in gray, and then the orange tributaries are the melange, mapped melange, and the gray tributaries are mapped non-melange. The circles indicate the top of the nick point. And so now this is where I said going from lumping to splitting. What we're noticing is that the top of the nick points are actually much higher in those tributaries and the melange tributaries. If you're not familiar with a chi plot at the bottom, just don't even worry about it. But what this actually shows, because in this space, these lines are steeper, we can see that those channels in the melange have a higher steepness. So what we did, Nathan being a good postdoc, he put me and Jane on boulder counts and Woolman point counts, which if anyone has done that is like literally backbreaking work. So there's Jane and I measuring boulders and doing point counts in a melange stream. And so we had this hypothesis, well, the melange streams, they're steeper, they probably have more boulders in them, And so that's probably why they're steeper. So we're seeing some kind of lithologic signal. So we were put in the melange stream, and then Kate and Nathan went off and they started doing boulder counts in the non-melange stream and what came out. So the x-axis is a little hard to interpret here. I would just urge you to look at the y-axis. And the left is the non-melange streams and the right is the melange streams. And the way we quantify that is number of boulders per channel length. And the x-axis or the y-axes are going to be the same in both the melange and the non-melange stream. So I don't know about you, but if you look at that, it doesn't seem like there's a lot more boulders in the melange stream than the non-melange stream. So that was not really what we were expecting, okay? So we thought, one other thing, we said, well, okay, maybe we can't exactly quantify it by number of boulders, but maybe there's different processes going on in these melange versus non-melange tributaries. And so one way to model different processes that are happening in the river is to change exponents in a power law, which I know sounds a little bit like you might be some, turning some knobs to get what you want, but just bear with me a second. So what we said is, well, we have these tributaries. Some are melange, some are non-melange. We think that the melange is behaving differently than the non-melange. And so from some theory that I'm not going to go into, we can vary the exponent in these two different watersheds. So the exponent is going to be on the incision model. I'm not even going to show you the equation. I'm just going to tell you that we do one with n equals 1 and the other one with n equals 2. And that is a slope exponent, okay? So what we said is, well, we're going to model these watersheds. So remember we said the main stem is cutting down, and then the tributaries at some point are going to respond to that increase in erosion rates in the main stem and send that upstream signal. So what Nathan did was he modeled two types of tributaries, one with n equals 1 and one with n equals 2, where the n equals 2 is thought to better represent the processes in melange, and the n equals 1 is thought to better represent the processes in non-melange. So what I'm going to show you here, and again, this is in a weird chi-space, so just try to look at, both of these are going to be perturbations in these tributaries, and you just want to look where the kink is in this line. So as you watch this, we'll just play. Okay, so you see where there's this kink. This would be the top of the nick point, and here this would be the top of the nick point. So all you want to look at is the elevation that is the top of the nick point in the non-melange versus the melange channels. And just take it back. And what you can see, first off, the melange channels already responded, and the non-melange channel is taking much longer to respond. And so what that means is that at any given time, the melange channel should have had its nick point propagate to a higher elevation, okay? And so that's sort of what our thinking is that there may be some processes, like we had to get really in the weeds for this to try to understand what is going on between the different channels and why some are steeper than others and in why the nick point has migrated higher. Okay, so basically at this point, I feel like I may understand the watershed slightly even less than I did before we got funding to actually work on it. And so there's a lot of known unknowns. And one of the biggest things that remains for me is, what is the difference between these, what's the process difference between these two different watersheds, and how can we go out and measure this and quantify it? Because we tried measuring boulders, we didn't get really data that we could make sense of. Maybe we just need to collect more data. But right now we're sort of at this point where we think we know what's going on in the main stem, and we're trying to decipher what's going on in the tributaries, and can we actually make sense of them? What data can we get? So I think more DM analyses could also help, because we're still really struggling to understand the differences between those two different types of channels. And part of the problem is we also don't know really well where the melange and non-melange contexts are. So future fieldwork could involve more grain size data collection and dating of the terraces and the tributaries, because we could use that same thing that we did in the main stem, on the tributaries to get at, well, do we see that upstream propagating signal? Is it the same timing in the melange versus the non-melange channels? We do think there's a process difference, but you know, it's a little bit, if you're gonna question me and say, Nicole, that's really arm wavy, I would say I agree. But this is where we started. So we started off saying we know the topography is transient, and I would say we still think the topography is transient, but we're still wondering what the driver is. So I kind of just said, oh, it's 100,000 years, it's related to climate, and you should absolutely ask me a question on that, because really, do we really think there should have been some perturbation about 100,000 years? That we need to dig into a little bit deeper. I still think that the area was not actually glaciated, but glacial and interglacial cycles may be really key here. And small changes in rainfall and temperature could have done something to sediment availability. They could have done something to the amount of runoff that could lead to kick off that sort of increased incision downstream. Definitely, I think the uniform rock assumption was a bad one at this place, but now we have to try to detangle what the importance of those different rock types are and how they fit into process. And so the weird thing is like, I am now not even mentioning passage of the Mendocino Triple Junction. And that feels strange as well, right? Because that's such a big perturbation to the topography. So it seems as though there should be some way that that is also imprinted on the landscape, but possibly other drivers are overprinting the signal of what's going on with the Mendocino Triple Junction. And maybe we need to come back in a million years to actually see that signal really showing its face in the South Fork Eel. And I'm gonna end there. This is a fabulous picture. And so that's Jane Willenbring again. And this is a tree growing in the river. And when we went out, it was right after a very, very, very wet winter in California. And so there had been floods in the mainstem and in the tributaries. And this is from one of the tributaries. And you can see this is just kind of surface process geek nerding out. This was probably abraded away. This is the upstream side of that tree. So we know there's sediment is getting moved, and they look at, these are pretty big gravel and boulders in this channel. So things are happening, and we just sort of need to start nailing down what some of those processes are, trying to understand them better. Thanks.
I do think, and I'm just going to say one thing, which is the, connections to the hill slope weathering and hydrology, depths of weathering, sediment production in the melange and non-melange makes it a complicated and really interesting story potentially, which is, I think it's great to embrace the complexity and the uncertainty. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Gasparini. We